She told her son good night with a smile, and 2 hours later, he crushed her skull while she slept. He didn't run. He didn't cry. He walked for miles through the dark, bought a soda, and calmly waited to be found. What makes a 15-year-old boy commit a murder so quiet, so deliberate, and then feel nothing? Her skull had collapsed inward, as if someone had tried to erase her face from existence. Blood had soaked into the mattress, pooled at the corners of the bed frame, smeared like dark paint across the nearby wall. One deep red streak ran in a downward curve, almost deliberate, almost careful. The pungent, metallic scent of blood mixed with the sickly sweetness of burnt fabric and flesh still hung thick in the air, clinging to the walls even after the fire had been extinguished. The room was silent, still, except for the distant crackle of cooling embers. No screams, no signs of struggle, just a body and a sledgehammer. Melanie Davis had been asleep when her youngest son Zachary entered the room. He did not whisper. He did not hesitate. The sledgehammer he carried was heavy, industrial, designed for breaking concrete, not human bone. But that night, it was used to destroy something far more fragile. A mother's face. 12 blows, maybe more. Each strike carefully spaced, each thud echoing against her skull with mechanical precision. This was not an explosion of rage. It was not blind fury. What stood out, what still haunts those who reviewed the scene, was the absence of chaos. Nothing was overturned, no lamps knocked down. Her body remained centered on the mattress, as if even in death, she had not been allowed to move. Zachary locked the bedroom door on his way out. Then, calmly, he tried to set the house on fire. It was a controlled scene, and that alone reframed everything investigators thought they understood about violence committed by adolescents. Most teenage offenders act impulsively. They strike out in moments of panic, confusion, desperation. But Zachary had waited. He had planned. He knew his mother's schedule. He knew what time she would fall asleep. And he knew what time his brother would return home, unaware that their family was already unraveling from within. Some believed at first that he was psychotic, that perhaps he had heard voices, had hallucinated danger, or truly believed he was saving someone. But there was no panic in his voice, no delusion in his words. When he later recounted the murder, his tone was even, deliberate, emotionless. He stated what he had done as if describing the steps to a mundane chore. He did not cry. He did not tremble. He said the shirt he wore had pieces of his mother's brain on it. That was why he changed clothes. The crime scene contradicted every basic profile of a spontaneous parricide. The choice of weapon alone, so physical, so intimate, so violent, suggested more than a desire to kill. It suggested a desire to obliterate, to control. A knife might have been easier, a gun quicker, but the sledgehammer required effort. It required presence. He had to be there for every moment, every sound of bone giving way, every final exhale. And he stayed. Why? That is the question that looms over the case even now. Not how. How is obvious, not when. But why? What happens in the mind of a 15-year-old boy that allows for this kind of methodical brutality? Somewhere in the years leading up to that night, something inside Zachary had fractured. Perhaps it began with grief. His father, Chris Davis, died when Zachary was just 9. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. A slow, humiliating disease that leaves children watching as their heroes wither into silence. After Chris died, Zachary withdrew. He became quiet, then distant. His mother, trying to protect him, relocated the family, hoping a new town would mean a new beginning. But grief does not disappear with geography. It burrows in, waiting. By age 11, Zachary was hearing voices. His father's voice, he said. There were therapy sessions, brief, inconsistent. His mother eventually stopped them. Maybe she thought he was getting better. Maybe she was overwhelmed. Or maybe she simply didn't want to believe what she was seeing. Inside the house, nothing seemed amiss. Texts between Zachary and his mother were loving, even gentle. She used heart emojis. He apologized when he overslept. They talked about going to the movies. To outsiders, they were an ordinary family. But what no one saw, what no one could have imagined, was that Zachary had been rehearsing a different story in his head. One where he was no longer the child left behind, but the one who decided how the story would end. The fire was not enough. He had hoped it would kill his brother too, but it didn't. And so the investigation began, not into whether Zachary had committed the crime, but into who or what he had become to do it. When officers found Zachary walking alone along a quiet stretch of road just a few hours after the fire had been reported, he didn't resist. He didn't run. He didn't ask why he was being detained. His shoes were still damp with morning dew, his hair flattened from sweat and smoke, and his eyes. They didn't flinch. He had no destination, no explanation. Just a small backpack slung over one shoulder, and a quiet detachment that unnerved even the most experienced among them. At the station, he was offered water. He thanked them. He was read his rights. He said he understood. The room where he was questioned had no windows, just 4 walls, a table, and 2 chairs. And yet Zachary looked more at ease there than anywhere else. He sat upright, hands folded neatly in his lap. His voice was flat, emotionless, as if he had long rehearsed what he was about to say. Yes, he admitted. He had killed his mother. He said it without hesitation. Then he described how he had waited for her to fall asleep, how he had stood outside her door for a while, listening, just to make sure. Then he went in. He did not scream. She did not wake. He struck her, again and again, until she stopped moving, until the sound changed. There was a moment in the footage, barely a second, when Zachary paused mid-sentence, not because he was emotional, but because he seemed to be choosing his words carefully, as if he didn't want to misrepresent the facts. He said he checked her neck for a pulse. There wasn't one. He said he made sure. When asked why, he offered no anger, no grief. He simply said he had been thinking about it for a long time. The investigator leaned forward, gently pushing him for more. Was there something she had done? Did she hurt him, neglect him? None of that, he said. She had been a good mom. Sort of. Then he stopped and looked down at the table. The question that followed seemed almost too fragile for the silence that had settled in the room. Did you feel anything? He shook his head. Not really. And then, just barely audible, he added, I laughed a little. That answer, the tone of it, the casual delivery, shifted the energy in the room completely. The investigator leaned back in his chair, unsure if what he was hearing was a confession or a performance. Laughter, in the face of something so final, so violent, is rare. Among juvenile offenders, it can point to deep dissociation, or, more dangerously, it can point to gratification, pleasure, not in the act itself, but in the control it gave, the ability to take something away, permanently. Zachary's writings, found later in his notebook and saved quietly in hidden folders on his phone, hinted at a growing fascination with death. Not just death itself, but the ritual of it. The idea that one could disappear another person, erase them from the narrative. He had bookmarked articles about infamous murderers. He had read about methods, mistakes, strategies. There was no pattern to his research, no clear obsession with any particular figure. It was broader than that. He wasn't looking to copy. He was studying. There was one entry, written months before the killing, that stood out. It said, in simple language, the mistake most people make is assuming there will be a sign. There won't be. A warning to himself, maybe, or to someone else. It was never clear. What was clear, though, was that he had thought about this for longer than anyone suspected. He had written notes with names, scenarios, contingencies, and yet, when the moment came, he didn't execute some grand plan. He walked, with no real place to go. Just distance, just silence, as if the act had exhausted the entire point of existing, as if everything he had built up to ended in that room. Some theorized that Zachary wanted to be caught, that the fire was not just an attempt to destroy evidence, but a symbolic ending, a burning down of the family he believed had already collapsed. But there were no letters, no declarations, no manifestos, just a kind of hollow finality. He said later that he assumed the fire would take care of everything, that maybe his brother would be caught in it, that maybe it would all just go away. But it didn't. And when asked if he regretted that, if he regretted that Josh survived, Zachary paused, looked up, and said, "I don't know." That phrase would appear again and again. "I don't know." Not with confusion, but with a kind of detachment that was harder to decipher. It was not the uncertainty of someone who had made a mistake. It was the indifference of someone who no longer recognized consequence. And that is what unsettled everyone the most. It was during the second hour of the interview that the tone began to shift. Not because Zachary showed emotion, but because of how firmly he refused to. His voice never cracked. His posture never wavered. Every answer was delivered in the same unchanging monotone, as if none of it belonged to him, as if he were reading from someone else's story. But the details were too sharp, too precise to be borrowed. He said he had packed a bag earlier that day. Not after the murder. Before. Inside were a few changes of clothes, some snacks, a notebook, and his phone. The same phone that contained search history entries about serial killers, unsolved murders, and how to disappear without being caught. One of the bookmarked pages was titled, "Understanding Schizophrenia." Another, "Most Common Mistakes That Get Killers Arrested." When asked about those, he didn't deny them. He just nodded, as if to say, "Yes, that was me." What becomes difficult in cases like this is the line between illness and intent. Zachary had been diagnosed with a depressive disorder. There were reports that he heard voices, but no one had seen signs of full psychosis in the days leading up to the murder. His teachers described him as quiet, polite, withdrawn. One counselor noted he struggled to connect with peers, that he often avoided eye contact. But there were no violent outbursts, no threats, no cries for help, just distance, just silence. When investigators pressed him further about his mental state, Zachary mentioned that sometimes he felt as if his thoughts were not his own, that he would hear his father's voice, telling him things, not loudly, not always clearly, but enough to make him wonder, enough to make him listen. He said he never knew if those voices were real. Then, without missing a beat, he added that he had been planning to kill his mother for years. That contradiction is where the mind catches. A child unsure of his reality does not usually carry out long-term planning with such composure. Yet Zachary had done both. He had listened to imagined voices, and also researched how to cover his tracks. He had said he felt nothing, and then described in clinical detail the angle of each swing, the sound her breathing made as it stopped. There was a drawing in his notebook. Crude. A figure standing over a bed. The proportions were wrong, the lines messy, but in the corner, almost hidden, was a label in small, careful handwriting. "Make sure the door is locked after." Above it, in all capital letters, "She will not wake up." The timing of it all was exact. He had waited until his older brother was distracted, until the house was quiet. He knew the layout. He knew which floorboards creaked. He struck only after confirming everyone else was asleep. That kind of deliberation, it does not come from chaos. It comes from a mind that has made peace with what it intends to do. And yet, there were moments, small, brittle moments, that suggested something else, something not entirely numb. He told investigators that after he left the house, he bought a bottle of soda from a nearby gas station. He said it like it mattered, like it was a detail that explained something. He had just committed one of the most brutal crimes imaginable, but what he remembered was the taste of cold soda, the way the bottle hissed when he twisted it open. Sometimes trauma does that. It clings to mundane sensations when the mind refuses to process the rest. Or maybe it was a performance, a calculated effort to appear removed, strange, unreadable. Some believed that Zachary wanted to be seen that way, that in his mind the killer is always composed, always unbothered. What disturbed those in the room most deeply was not what he said, but what he refused to say. He never described her face, never called her mom. He said her or the body. He referred to the room as the place. When asked if he missed her, he paused for a long time, then said slowly, "I don't think so." There was no grief, no joy, no clarity, only that blank, unwavering calm. When they showed him a photo of her, one taken just days before, smiling, with her hand on his shoulder, Zachary stared at it for several seconds, then looked away. He didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just said, "I don't remember that day." And for the first time, the room felt cold. Not from fear, not from horror, but from something deeper, something hollow and irretrievable. There was a notebook recovered from the wreckage, miraculously intact, slightly charred at the edges, but the words inside survived. Most of it was scribbled nonsense, fragments of sentences, symbols, half-formed thoughts. But in the middle, nestled between pages stained with ash, there were two entries written with striking clarity. One described what Zachary claimed happened years earlier, an accusation of abuse. One, no investigation ever substantiated. The other was written after the murder, short, direct, a confession. "I didn't feel anything. I didn't feel remorse. My only true regret was that I didn't give her a faster death." That sentence, it lingered in the minds of everyone who read it. The phrasing, the logic, the absence of empathy was not what struck hardest. It was the cold, practical weight of that regret. As if mercy had crossed his mind, but never reached his hands. And yet, even now, nothing about Zachary's presentation matched the crime itself. There was no visible rage, no frantic energy, just stillness. Even during his psychiatric evaluations, he remained composed. He spoke of what he had done without embellishment, without avoidance. But with every answer, it became harder to understand what part of him, if any, recognized the humanity in what he had destroyed. A psychologist later described his affect as flat. She said he showed no markers of mania, no signs of active psychosis at the time of the murder. He was not disconnected from reality. In fact, he was disturbingly aware. He could recount his actions with detail and accuracy. He knew what death meant. He knew what it looked like. Still, the diagnoses came: schizophrenia, depressive disorder, possible dissociative symptoms, but none of them explained the way he planned. None explained how he was able to wait, to think, to carry the weight of an idea for years without speaking it aloud. That kind of restraint is rare, especially in adolescence. Most violent acts at that age are impulsive, erratic, but Zachary was patient. There was something else in the file, a note on his phone from several months before the murder. Not a threat, not a plan, just a sentence. "I wish I felt something." He wrote it once, then deleted it, but the system saved a cached version. When asked about it, he didn't remember writing it, or pretended not to. Either way, it was the closest thing to pain anyone could find. What becomes apparent when you study cases like this is that evil is rarely loud. It doesn't announce itself with cruelty or spectacle. More often, it appears in the form of neglect, silence, a slow, private erosion of connection. Zachary had no close friends, no one outside his immediate family. He communicated with his brother through short texts. He rarely spoke in class. And yet, he had thoughts. Entire inner worlds, carefully guarded, visible only through the cracks he allowed others to see. In one of his writings, he described himself as a shadow, always watching, never noticed. He said people forgot he was there, even when he was in the room. That sentence revealed something that few noticed in time: his invisibility. Not literal, of course, but emotional, social. And sometimes, when someone feels invisible long enough, they do something to be remembered. It is not a justification, it is not even an explanation, but it is a pattern. One seen in the quietest corners of too many homes. When connection dies, when presence fades, when no one sees, someone begins to disappear from themselves. Zachary's story is not just a tragedy because of what he did. It is a tragedy because of how long he was drifting toward it, unseen, unheard. And when he finally spoke, it was not with words. It was with a hammer and fire and silence that followed. At trial, Zachary Davis sat motionless, his hands folded loosely in his lap. His hair had grown longer, slightly uneven, as if he had been cutting it himself, or perhaps stopped caring altogether. He didn't glance around the courtroom. Not at the jurors, not at the attorneys, not even at his brother, who sat only a few feet behind him, rigid and silent, eyes downcast. Zachary kept his gaze forward, fixed somewhere just beyond the wood of the defense table, as if the space in front of him held more meaning than the faces that surrounded it. There was no outburst, no emotional breakdown, no apology. When asked to stand, he did so without resistance. When asked to speak, he gave answers that seemed rehearsed not in content but in cadence, the same quiet rhythm that marked his earlier confession. Calm, detached, almost polite. And then, without warning, he changed everything. "I didn't do it," he said. The words dropped into the room like a slow pulse. No explanation followed, no elaboration, just the quiet weight of contradiction. He claimed his brother Josh had killed their mother, that he had only taken the blame, that everything said before, every confession, every detail, every word, was a lie, a cover, a sacrifice. The courtroom stilled. For a moment, it was hard to tell if anyone even breathed. But Zachary remained unmoved. It was the first time in years that his narrative shifted, and it did so without emotion, without urgency. He did not cry foul. He did not plead for justice. He simply offered an alternate truth and stood by it, like someone placing a final stone in a structure already collapsing. No one believed him. The evidence was too strong, too detailed, too consistent. His confession, the forensic timeline, the contents of his phone, the surveillance footage of him alone at the gas station, all of it aligned with only one conclusion: that he had killed his mother, that he had done so willingly, methodically, without remorse. Even his own legal team was caught off guard. They filed for mistrial, argued incompetence, suggested he was unfit to continue. But the judge denied the motion. The trial resumed. And when the verdict came down, it was swift. Guilty of first-degree murder, guilty of attempted murder, guilty of aggravated arson. 71 years. No parole before 51. The sentence was read aloud in a courtroom filled with echoes. Zachary blinked once, then looked down at the floor. That was all. No one cried, not even Josh. There was a strange stillness to the moment, as if everyone had already mourned what was lost long before the verdict arrived. In the weeks that followed, there were interviews, debates, discussions about whether Zachary was mentally ill or simply evil, about how a child so young could carry such darkness, and how no one saw it coming, or maybe, how no one wanted to. But the truth is never singular. It bends, it shifts, it adapts to the silence we leave around it. Zachary was not a monster in the traditional sense. He had no violent past, no long list of warnings. He was quiet, withdrawn, an ordinary boy whose mind had wandered too far into isolation and never found its way back. He once wrote that the worst kind of loneliness is not being alone. It is being with people who don't know you're disappearing. That line stayed with me. because that is how this story began. Not with a scream or a threat, but with silence. The slow unraveling of someone who had so much inside him, and no one to hold it, no one to ask, no one to hear. And by the time he was ready to be seen, it was too late.